You've got production, as Lorne mentioned, all around Cambodia. You've got Thailand that's had production on the go for 40 years. You've got Laos, you've got Vietnam, onshore, offshore production. So it's time for Cambodia to step in as well. And we're really excited to be the only company currently with the right to an onshore oil block. And that's a really special place to grow for Angkor and for energy.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in as always. I'm sitting down today with Stephen Borrega, CEO of Angkor Resources. Stephen, nice to have you back on the show. How you doing?
Excellent, thanks. Thanks very much for having us today.
Great. And also joining us today, first time, Lorne Rosenthal, Vice President of Exploration for Enercam Resources, which is the oil exploration arm of Angkor. Lorne, how are you today?
I'm good. Happy to be here.
Yeah. And Lorne, I understand you're a prairie boy like myself, so you're dealing with all the nice cold weather recently, managing to stay warm?
Well, it's warmed up to a balmy minus 32 last night. That's without the wind chill.
Yeah.
But it's broken and looks like we're on the mend here now.
Oh, that's good.
Long couple weeks.
Yeah, it has been a long couple of weeks. Well, why don't we start, Lorne, since you're new to the show, I want to start with you. Maybe you could give everybody a background on yourself, your experience in the oil and gas space. I think that would be a good place to start.
Okay, start my background education-wise. Have a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD in geology at University of Manitoba and McMaster University. I started in the industry about 1978, so that's coming on 43 years of experience. Most of my experience has been Western Canada. I literally drilled hundreds of wells out here with both majors, intermediates, and small independents. Most of my work has been, I'd say, technical on the geologic side, professional geologist certified, and I have literally spent my entire career in exploration development programs, working with seismic, working with drill cores, working with outcrop data, and trying to define and explore for commercial oil and gas.
Okay,
I've been involved with the Cambodian project coming on 5 years now. I've done 5 trips over to Cambodia, and I really like the story. I think we've got a really tight little story and a good go forward plan.
Okay, well, 43 years, that's a lot of experience. So I'm assuming that's going to come in very handy here. Why don't we, the next step maybe to give people an overview. I sometimes like to think of when I look at, say, a gold deposit or uranium deposit, I look at what are the ingredients you need to form that. Same thing for an oil deposit. Could you walk us through what are the key ingredients needed to get a prospective oil deposit, and how does your current property at Block 8 in Cambodia fit into that?
Okay, by way of Geology 101 or Exploration 101, essentially what you need is a sedimentary basin, which is a downwarp in the crust, in which you've had a succession of sedimentary strata or layers or formations deposited in that. There are probably 99.9% of the oil and gas reserves around the world are found in sedimentary rock. And there probably is a minimum thickness required because there's a number of different parameters we need to actually define an oil and gas deposit, and I'll list them here quickly. First, obviously, you need the sedimentary basin itself. Second is that you need a source of the organic material. The consensus is very, very strong that virtually all the oil and gas in the world is in or was derived from the pressure temperature alteration of organic rich sedimentary rocks. So we need organic rich sedimentary rocks. If you looked at it, it would be black, organic, high carbon, and typically it's a conglomeration of plant material, algal material. In a sedimentary basin, that gunk, if you think about it, is basically buried, and at temperature and pressure, it expels oil and gas out into the surrounding sedimentary rocks. The second thing you need in terms of once you have the gunk, you need the appropriate temperature and pressure, and typically you get that by burial. So if we have this layer of black organic rich sedimentary rock and you bury it to depths of anywhere from 1 to 10 kilometers, over time, you get a succession of material, almost like a distillation process. That material is cooked out, and often they use the term the kitchen. You need a hydrocarbon kitchen to generate the hydrocarbons. And finally, to trap the hydrocarbons, you need some kind of porous sedimentary rock. If you think of a jar of marbles, you have basically particles of sand or carbonate material with holes in between. And that oil that's been expelled out of the gunk or the goop basically finds its way into those. And we can, with a drill bit, drill into the layer made of those sedimentary particles and drain the liquid oil or the gaseous natural gas that's found in that pore space. The third component that you really need is a structural trap. You need some kind of way that oil, because oil or gas, both being lighter than water, always want to migrate to a higher point in the geologic structure. And you need something like we would call a fault, like something like the San Andreas in California. We could have fold structures, but you need some kind of structural culmination that would trap the oil and gas. And I think we could say as a general term that probably 90+% of the sedimentary basins around the world have been pretty extensively explored. The basins that haven't been explored have been for one of two reasons. One is that they're just logistically or weather-wise inhospitable, like the Arctic basins, for example. Or the other is that there's political issues or historical issues why sedimentary basins have not been explored. But I think we can make a case that virtually all the oil and gas around the world is in big, thick sedimentary basins. And specific to the Cambodia, what I'd say is we have unequivocal evidence that we have a large, completely undrilled sedimentary basin that has never been targeted, never been explored. We have all the ingredients with regards to, we have the source rock, we have the oil and gas surrounding on three sides of it, and commercial size accumulations in Vietnam, Thailand, and the Gulf of Thailand. And in addition to that, we've got some data that has been, some geophysical data that has been shot onshore that indicates that the sedimentary basins which we see onshore do extend, we see them offshore, they extend onshore. So all the basic ingredients are there. I've gone back on 5 different occasions to both do a review of the data that's available in the government offices, and also spent a couple of weeks on a road trip just getting the lay of the land and seeing what surface outcrop information was available.
Okay, and Stephen, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you have some slides that Lorne can maybe speak to with respect to the specific outlook in Cambodia.
Absolutely. Let's just load this up so we can take you through a couple of our core slides here.
And so I think just to start off, for anyone that maybe missed our first interview, Enercam is the wholly owned subsidiary of Angkor Resources, correct?
It is majority owned. We have raised some capital at the Enercam level, but it's still majority owned by the parent Angkor Resources.
Okay.
All right. There are some forward-looking statements in today's presentation. Go ahead, Lorne. Okay,
this is a starting point of Block 8 is specifically the parcel that Enercam has identified. So the government of Cambodia has broken the country into about 25 different blocks. I would stress again, none of these blocks have ever been tested with an exploratory drill hole. In addition, on the left-hand side of that diagram, we have a series of offshore blocks. On the extreme bottom left of that diagram those are oil and gas pools that have been identified and are currently on production in the Gulf of Thailand. There's what was historically a disputed area in between, just to the east of that, which is again offshore concessions that have been developed. What we're looking at specifically is the area in the red oval there, Block 8. It's called the Kampong Som Basin. It's been identified on some offshore seismic and some regional geology. And the first interpretation of this, very importantly, this was described as a foreland basin in 2016 by researchers working for the Danish Geological Survey, who were looking at marine seismic database just to the south of that red dot. If you think of where the bottom of that red dot, it looks like it cuts across an island. It's called Phu Quoc Island. And they actually drilled an exploratory test out there just to confirm surface outcrop. And I make a very strong statement at the bottom there. The Kampong Sum Basin is a foreland basin. I'm fully agreement. And it has a very similar geology and origin to some of the world's most important oil-forming foreland basins. Just again, for reference geology again, the Cambodia is kind of right in the center of that diagram, but there is commercial oil and gas deposits on three sides of oil and gas. On the left-hand side, the Gulf of Thailand, which we talked about. Those are relatively young Cenozoic or Mesozoic rift basins, and some very, very prolific oil and gas has been deposited. Recently, Chris Energy has just brought on the first production in that. It was on a concession that they purchased or acquired from Chevron. To the north, in what's called the Korat Plateau in Thailand, there's a massive dry gas field that was developed in the 1980s. It's already produced 325 BCF. And to the south, there's a big basin, offshore basin, which is called the Kulong Basin. Again, it's been extensively developed already, and there's a recent exploration commitment by SR out of India, they're committing, I believe it's $11 billion, Stephen, onto the south and eastern extension of the Kulong Basin. So in a specific to the area we're looking at, I'd say there's oil and gas on three sides of it. This is an area that I think has been completely unexplored and overlooked for a number of reasons. But I think the opportunity here, the more work that I've done on this, the more encouraged we are that there is very significant opportunity for world-class oil, land, or gas onshore in Cambodia. Next slide. Again, this is what we described, the regional tectonic framework. We don't need to get into the geology, but what we're saying again is that this is a very, very complex, probably the most complex geology in the world. When I described earlier, to get oil and gas accumulation, you need a sedimentary basin. And this is not my work particularly. This is work that's been identified by the USGS, and they describe what they call the Kampong Som Basin. And what we identified in Block 8, we picked that of all the onshore basins that we could have acquired in Cambodia. We picked that because it was dead center on the Kampong Som Basin. What we believe is that in these sedimentary basins, you can get, it's kind of like a three-bear story. It can be too hot, too cold, and not just right. The Korat Plateau Basin is in a very high thermal maturity, and as a result, there won't be any oil gas to date has been found. The only thing we found in there is dry gas. The work that has been done in Block 8, and it's been identified both in surface seeps and in for the evidence that's been done collected by the Danish Geological Survey, it looks like we're in the oil window in the Kampong Som Basin. So again, there's not a lot of very strong data, but the data there is that of anywhere we're going to be working with in Cambodia, this is probably the place to be starting. Next slide, please. This is kind of a cartoon diagram, but I'm going to introduce the concept of a foreland fold thrust belt and a foreland basin. And I make the case that it's very, very significant. Probably half of all the world oil reserves are in what's called a foreland basin. A foreland basin, it would be on the left-hand side of this. This is an example from the Zagros Mountains, the Persian Gulf, going from Saudi Arabia on the left, Qatar, and Iran. And it's essentially a cross-section, a geologic cross-section going from south and west to north and east. And what you see on the right-hand side is what's called the Zagros Mountains. And you can see in cross-section that the surface elevation is elevated. That's Iran. And that's a foreland fold thrust belt. Now, parallel to the fold and thrust belt, out in front of it is a large sedimentary downwarp, which we would call a Foreland Basin. And the analogy that I make is that in the Danish Geological Survey was the first to identify this, but I think that was only 2016. We jumped on it right away. We have a Foreland fold and thrust belt and a sedimentary basin in Cambodia, which I think is analogous, at least structurally, to what we see in the Zagros and the Persian Gulf. I'm not going to stand up and say it's the same size or the reserves are anywhere close to what we've got there, but structurally, geologically, it's a direct analog to say we have on the eastern side of our Block 8, we have what's called the Elephant Mountains, and on the western side, we have a Foreland fold thrust belt, which is on the order of kilometers in thickness, which has never been drilled. And all we want to do, it's a pretty simple story, is to go in and get some seismic, drill some exploratory tests, because all indications are that we've got all the ingredients we need. We've got source rock, we've got the right level of maturation, thermal maturity, and we've got excellent multiple zones with excellent reservoir quality, which we believe could host world-class oil and gas deposits. Next slide, please. Again, this is kind of maybe more detail than we need, but this is work. The red indicates the distribution of our block, Block 8. And again, if this is a data that's out of the Danish Geological Survey, what they're showing is that if you go offshore, they have what's called the Kampot Fold Belt, and that would be equivalent to the mountains, the Elephant Mountains that are onshore on the east side of Block 8. So that is the Foreland fold and thrust belt, and the area immediately to the west of that, which is the bulk of our Block 8, is this Foreland Basin that we're targeting. They have seismic offshore just to the south of Phu Quoc Island, which shows that sedimentary basin is on the order of 2 to 3 kilometers in thickness. We believe very strongly on the basis of the regional geology that the Foreland Basin that's offshore, that the Danish survey has identified offshore and trending onshore, extends across Block 8. And quite simply, that's the reason we selected Block 8 out of 30 blocks to start the exploration program. Next slide. This is a cross-section of the Kampong Som Basin that's from the offshore. So again, offshore, the Danes were doing this as a regional international development work. And what they were doing was towing these reflection seismic equipment across on trend with the basin. And this is identification they've got. So what they're showing here is that the green is the targeting, and the TWT means two-way time. What you're seeing is that we have a basin on the order of 2 or 2.5 kilometers in thickness going to the base of the Cretaceous. And you have, if you see that regional downwarp, it's kind of you can just follow the original layers. You can see that they're kind of dipping down, kind of concave into the center of the basin. It is our very strong belief that this sedimentary basin, which they've identified offshore, and these lines are relatively close, extend onshore onto Block 8 in southwestern Cambodia, and the Phu Quoc Kampot Basin is our target in this program. This is kind of an interesting model of this is the sum entirety of all the amount of data that's ever been shot in Cambodia. It was shot by an international data acquisition by the name of PGS. And literally, the Block 8 that you see is on the, Steve is showing it that with his cursor. There's literally 2 lines. So to me, this is unbelievable that in a sedimentary basin that I think we can make a very strong case, there's virtually no data to work with. There's a more extensive grid has been shot further to the north on Block 11. I've actually, in the course of these trips, I've been out to Cambodia. I've had a chance to see most of this data. A lot of this data is actually available online, but the data that's on Block 8 is very, very sparse. But I'm still seeing what we're very encouraged what we see there as a good example where we've got large-scale structures in a broad regional sedimentary basin or crustal downwarp. Get the next slide. In the last trip that I made out, another thing we need oil and gas. I did a 2-week field trip, spent probably 1,000 kilometers driving some of the roughest roads I've ever seen in my life with a group of Cambodian nationals, and I was able to take some samples, brought them back to a lab here. Just go to the next slide, please, and we'll come back to this one, Stephen. This is some of the Permian limestone that we saw that I was able to sample on the Block 8 in Cambodia. And this is pretty much the most reservoir I've ever seen in my life. The sample you can see are these big, coarse, buggy holes or pores in the rock. We brought these cores back to Core Lab in Calgary, and that particular rock sample had porosity of 34.4%, permeability of 8,240 or 8.2 darcies. Quite honestly, this is the highest porosity and perm I've ever encountered ever in my entire working career. It's as good as it gets. And it's very, very important because it's another box to check off of the things we need to get oil and gas. We need some kind of porous, permeable rock to store that rock once it's migrated out of the black organic rich source rock. We go to
Lorne, just for clarification for people that might not know, permeability is just the ease with which oil or fluid can flow through the rock, correct? And
yeah,
porosity is the void space.
Yeah, and I'll build on that. Porosity is basically a measure of what percentage of that rock has pores or holes that could host either gas or oil or water. Permeability is the degree to which those pores are interconnected. So it's conceivable to have a high porosity rock and you think of something like a styrofoam, which has got a lot of pores in it, but there's no way of moving any fluid through that. This permeability is a measure of the degree to which that pore spaces are interconnected. A standard cutoff that I use in conventional oil and gas exploration is 1.0 millidarcy. The stuff that we're drilling in the States, where they're doing the frac in the Permian Basin, they're going for 0.1, 0.2, or nanodarcies of permeability. We've got 8,240 millidarcies. This is extremely high porosity. Seriously, anywhere in the world, this is as good as it gets. And this was one of our targets on the exploration block in Block 8. Next slide, please. Again, the summary is that this is a very, very complicated geologically, but what we're showing here is that you do have a basin centered on Block 8 without a drill hole in it. And again, it is going to be, this isn't something we're going to come in and drill one well and hit a home run. But I think the evidence is that we've got all the ingredients that we need. And in addition to that, on Block 8, we've got a number of oil and gas seeps that have been documented both by ourselves, our own. I've, again, visited these seeps on 3 different occasions. The Danish Geological Survey did a well bore, a shallow 500-meter well bore, and did thermal maturity on that. And they deduced that it was in the oil basin, the oil window. And the fact that we have oil and gas seeps that are literally leaking into ditches and shallow lagoons and puddles indicates, I think, a very good case that we've got appropriate thermal maturity of that organic rich sedimentary material. The only issue is, and I stress this over and over again, that the zones that we're looking at are buried at depths of 2 to 3, possibly 4 kilometers. And we haven't got a drill because we haven't got a test well down there. We've got no way to deduce what the thermal maturity is at depth. But I would say it's a very, very good sign as an explorationist that we can get you can get oil and gas seeps on surface. Going to make one other point in here, and this is go to the next slide. Just to the north of this basin, in the Korat Plateau, the USEIA, which is kind of the gold standard of regional geologists, have gone in and looked at the oil and gas potential of the Korat Plateau, the Permian reservoirs in Thailand. And again, if you go back, you just retreat to the previous slide again. Show what they're showing in green in the Korat Plateau Basin to the north, and the Tonle Sap and the Kampong. Those are essentially the same sedimentary basins that were probably all joined up at one time, and they've since been broken up by younger faults, like the Meiping fault zone, that red line going from north and west to south and east. But at one time, those were probably one contiguous basin. So we don't have data on the Kampong Song Basin because nobody's drilled, but we do have a very good database on the Korat Plateau Basin just to the north. And if we go to the next slide, no less than the US EIA looked at this, and they've made a direct comparison of the Korat Plateau Basin, the Permian sands, of Thailand to those in Texas. And they compare in 4 different ways. One, the age and depositional environment. They're all lower Permian marine limestones. Total thickness is over 1,000 feet. Total organic rich is 200 feet. And the total organic carbon is 3%. Again, those are all very good evidence that we've got the organic source rock in place. So I'm not going to say, again, I'm not going to stand up and say that we've got another Permian Basin in Cambodia, but I will say this is not my work. This is recent work by 2015 by the US Geological Survey, and they've already made the comparison. All I'm doing is pointing it out. So this is again, the data that I presented here, the Danish Geological, 2016, this work 2015. This is all pretty new data that's pointing that this is a good place to be looking for oil and gas. And I'm very, very encouraged by what we've seen so far. What we need to do as an exploration is we need to get in there, get some data. We have to shoot a 2D program. We have to drill some exploratory tests. But I think all the ingredients are in place in this basin to develop a world-class oil and gas deposits. And I'm very encouraged to be working, very excited to be working with Enercan. Most of the work I've done in my career is working very close in where there's Western Canada, there's hundreds of thousands of wells, millions of miles of seismic. This is kind of opportunity of a lifetime to be working in an area that's really rank wildcat exploration, and the sky is the limit in terms of what we could be finding out here.
So Lorne, I guess speaking of Western Canada, and I know Stephen mentioned this in our first interview, he said Alberta is also Foreland Basin. Could you perhaps draw an analogy that Cambodia represents today what, say, Alberta would have been in the early 1900s?
I think we can make that comparison. I'll start by saying right now, there's literally hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells have been drilled, exploratory and development in Western Canada. But those have been drilled primarily since the Leduc the big discovery was 1947, which ushered in basically the real big industry wave of exploration in Western Canada. But if you go back before that, the initial development was drilling up surface seeps in the mountains, on the edge of the mountains in the 1920s. Turner Valley was starting in 1916 through 1920. And I think we can make a direct comparison that's the level of exploration we were dealing at that time. There was a few surface seeps identified on surface, and somebody with guts and some venture capital behind them drilled and ultimately developed the basin. Mm-hmm. What I'd say is that the difference now is that we've got really good technology behind us. In 1927, 1920s, they were really looking at surface accumulations and surface seeps and drilling underneath. Now, what we've got right now is very sophisticated technology for identifying drill targets at depth. We can do airborne surveys, airborne mag, airborne gravity, ground-based seismic, 2D or 3D. We've got very, very good, much higher level of technology, and we've got much, much better drilling equipment out here. Wells that would have taken months or even years in Alberta in the 1920s, they'll be drilling those in days or weeks. So let's say weeks right now. So the level of technology, I think, has really upped the game here, because I think the the risks are a lot lower because we're able to use 2021 technology in a basin that really was like Alberta 100 years ago.
Right. So is it fair to say that the opportunity in Cambodia today, it's pretty hard to find something of comparable opportunity elsewhere in the world that doesn't deal with, I think you mentioned in your discussion either the significant infrastructure, temperature issues, say northern Russia, or some jurisdictional issues. Is it fair to say the oil and gas opportunity in Cambodia ranks up there in terms of what's left that doesn't have those big impediments?
I think that's a fair comparison. I think every explorer out there would like to believe that they've got the only basin that's untested in the world. But I think this is fair. This is a basin. It's got all the ingredients, and it has not been tested. And the area we picked in Block 8 is extremely accessible. It's right beside. Basically, it's dissected by paved all-weather roads. Very close to the location of a new refinery that's either being built or is close to completion in in Cambodia. And honestly, you couldn't have picked a better location. It's in a country that desperately needs, right now it's completely dependent on external sources for energy supply. And it's a very easy terrain to be working in. I've worked in some pretty rugged and inhospitable areas around the world. And if you look at the push that's gone, now they're going into deeper water like the offshore Brazil, but they're in thousands of meters of water, very, very difficult. Northern basins at Russia and Norway are proving the Johannes Sverdrup Basin, very, very difficult logistically, weather-wise. Honestly, Cambodia, I would say, is as good as it gets.
And I think you brought up a point that I was going to ask, and the point was if you were to explore this, Block 8, be successful, find economic oil, where would you process it? I think you kind of answered the question already. There's a refinery nearby that it could get to.
You want to take that, Stephen?
Sure. There's a refinery that's planned in Cambodia. It's been commissioned. The initial development has begun. It's not been completed, but it's literally 50 kilometers off our westernmost border of Block 8. So it's needless to say, infrastructure-wise, it's there. There's also a deep water port very close to our borders as well to support in and out access. And as Lorne just pointed out, you've got a country that is anxious to become self-sufficient. Cambodia has had to rely on the importation of a lot of its basic needs. So you've got a government that's very, very supportive of the development of resource sectors, and the oil and gas sector is top of the list. So for the fact that Cambodia has just recently achieved such a great milestone through KrisEnergy out of Singapore's development and beginning of bringing oil to surface is a massive step in the right direction. So Cambodia as a government and as a country is eager to see it continue. And perhaps we might want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about where Enercam stands and where Anchor stands with regards to the process that we need to take moving forward, because there's a few steps that we have to follow in order to secure and finalize our ownership or our access to Block 8.
Yeah, and maybe before we do that, Stephen, I guess one comment I would make, I guess you could probably look at this as another ingredient to success with oil and gas exploration is almost a regulatory and investment climate. And I don't want to get political here, but you could probably make an argument in Canada, for example, that there's a bit of hostility, from the federal government, certainly to oil and gas exploration. It sounds like we certainly don't have that sort of regulatory and investment climate in Cambodia. The government, wants to find energy, develop energy through oil and gas. Is that fair?
I think it's very fair to say it. And you have to remember, Cambodia is a young country still. So as a young country, they want to be able to benefit from the development of their natural resources, just like Canada did. We were fortunate to be an extremely powerful country as a result of our being able to develop these assets and Cambodia should have the similar right to do so. So the government is very keen to see the development happen. So they're supportive of companies like Enercam and Angkor coming to the table to bring world-class experts like Lorne to work with their teams, to work with young geologists, and to really develop their sector, their oil and gas sector, and as you know from previous interviews, the hard rock sector as well, the base metal and precious metal sector.
So, Lorne, before we switch to the production sharing agreement, I had one last question. Maybe is it too early to, or are you able to qualify somehow what is the scale potential here for Block 8 if you're successful in finding oil based on what you know to date? Or do you have any sense for, how big this could be how many wells, how many million barrels of oil?
I was scared you were going to ask that. And the only reason is that's probably, we're looking for world-class tens to hundreds of millions of barrels, and we're completely unconstrained by the area. The size of the basin that we've already got, we could easily accommodate multiple fields on that size. But it's really, really difficult to put a credible, to put a number, float a number out there. Sure. What I'd say is that the ingredients are there and the structures that we're looking at are large, which is a good sign. The source rock, as I said, is very rich, comparable to West Texas. The reservoir is the best I've ever worked on in my life. So the basic elements are there, but to actually put a number and say this is a 10 or 100, these have the potential to be very big fields. But that said, there's not a lot of data to define right now. And I'm just so anxious to get out there to get some proper cutting edge modern technology seismic and see what these structures look like, because offshore, and I showed you on that one slide, they look very impressive, very big. Mm-hmm. So it's a very good sign. We just need some more data.
And you haven't come across any data so far. I know a lot of your data you're extrapolating from sort of nearby areas because the data on your block itself, as you mentioned, is kind of sparse, but nothing that you've seen so far has been sort of against the thesis that there's something big there. Everything sounds like it's supporting the thesis.
I think that's a good question. And if we looked at it to say, if we had to roll the tape back and go into Cambodia again, I would do exactly the same thing we've got. I think we've got the right block. And if anything, the evidence, we've acquired some data from a third party that did a lot more geochemical work. There are more seeps, and I think they're better documented. I'd like to go back out there. We're doing some work with the Cambodian nationals out of Phnom Penh, and they are going to be investigating some of these seeps in more detail. When I was there covering a lot of ground and trying to do a lot of things, I saw probably half a dozen, but realistically, we got to get in on a much more comprehensive. Everything I've seen, and that doesn't happen very often in exploration. Usually, the further you get along, the more you find reasons why other guys haven't been in there. In this, the more work we've collected, I think the more enthused and encouraged we are by Block 8.
Okay, interesting. Okay, Stephen, let's pivot to you for a moment. Then the production sharing agreement. I know we touched on it a little bit in our first interview. That is kind of the next step that has to happen for you to secure the ability to get the license at Block 8. Can you maybe walk us through what's involved in this process? What would the timeline be?
So that is the next big step with the government. So as I mentioned in our previous chat, in early March 2020, as the health crisis sort of took hold, we were actually in the middle of our production sharing contract negotiations with the Cambodian government. So they're very, as I mentioned, they're very supportive, and they've actually developed an exceptional contract. They've clearly brought in some very strong consultants from outside who have experience in developing this type of paperwork, this type of contracting. This is from all review from our legal counsel and expertise. It is a bankable document that is IFC compliant. and adheres to all of the international standards and expectations that you'd want to have in place as you develop a sector like this. So we're very pleased with that. And the next step for us is we're going to be working again, re-engaging with the Cambodian government to finalize the negotiations. And we've already, we've moved forward already. So it's not like we're starting from scratch, but we have to, the time is not set as of today. But my hope is that sometime in the next 60 to 90 days, we are back at the table and finalizing this.
And that's like about a 1 month process, Stephen. Is that fair, or what kind of timeline are we looking?
It
Hard to
really
say.
It's impossible for me to say if it's going to take 2 weeks or 2 months. It's just one of those processes that we believe that we're going in with a lot of strong data. We've crunched our numbers. We believe we understand what we need to see in order to be a successful, financially successful venture for the company, for our shareholders. And it all comes down to the fact that we've obviously seen some significant increases in the price of oil over the past months. We've seen a rebound in the market as a whole, but it's also important to note that as Lorne mentioned earlier, Cambodia is in great need of energy security. So whether it be an oil and gas, liquid hydrocarbon story, or a gas story, both are still very much relevant to Cambodia. So if you could call it a fallback plan, I mean, if we're successful in identifying gas at its as well, that's a positive story for us. Needless to say, we're looking for liquid hydrocarbons, but even if it's just a gas story, we'll be pleased. But on the whole, negotiations will begin as soon as we can, and you've got a government that really wants to see us succeed, because through our success, they're establishing the onshore aspect of an industry that is still nascent, that's still growing. As I mentioned, now that they've got that milestone under their belt to be able to say that they're an oil-producing country, it's a spectacular success. It's a massive story for them, and now they're part of the club. You've got production, as Lorne mentioned, all around Cambodia. You've got Thailand that's had production on the go for 40 years. You've got Laos, you've got Vietnam, onshore, offshore production. So it's time for Cambodia to step in as well. And we're really excited to be the only company currently with the right to an onshore oil block. And that's a really special place for us, for Angkor and for Enerchem.
Yeah, very much so. And, interesting comment on the market. The oil has certainly performed well recently. And I've heard some really compelling arguments from some smart people that oil could continue to really outperform, that we've seen some significant supply destruction from what happened in 2020. And that is going to come back to sort of haunt, the industry later. That supply has been taken offline, the capital has disappeared, and that is, arguably a big catalyst for pushing prices higher. So, even macroeconomically, you might be in a really good situation. So assuming the successful negotiation of the PSA, what would be the key first steps in exploration, and what kind of budget would you be looking to, for something like that?
Lorne, I'll take a first run and then you could get into some specifics. How about that? Look, as a small company, as a junior, we have to keep in mind that exploration costs for the oil and gas side of things are significantly more expensive than what we're accustomed to in our hard rock side of the business. So I'm actively out looking for strategic partnership on this project. We certainly have the means and the ability to leverage the structure that we have in place. As I mentioned previously on our last interview, our last meeting, yeah, we've established a private company in Singapore to hold the rights and the asset, and it allows us to fundraise in that private company. So whether it be through a strategic investment or whether it be we raise the capital privately, one way or the other, we're going to do that, and then the base program will include, as Lorne suggested, the nuts and bolts of exploration on the oil and gas side. Seismic needs to be shot. We need aeromag. We need regional programs. But Lorne, I don't want to get into the detail that you should be sharing.
Well, that's a really good question and a really difficult one to get clarity on, just because the costs of data acquisition have really changed. What I would refer to is that there's another company that we've talked about kind of at a similar state of development that had a 400 kilometer 2D grid, which is about what I'd like to see here, shot onshore, and it cost them $2 million. They were able to do, they have a $10 million budget in total. So about $1 million for the airborne mag, $2 million for seismic, and they think they could get 2 and possibly 3 exploratory tests within a $10 million budget. I'm not saying we have $10 million in the bank, but that's the numbers that we're talking about. And that's important because those numbers are for finding world-class, potentially world-class deposits. That's as good as it gets. We're not having to drill down at 4 and 5 kilometer depths in here. We're talking relatively shallow depths because, again, the shallow has never even been tested. So the numbers, I'd say, are doable, and the market is a lot stronger. I've number of involvement with a number of other small companies based in Canada here, and the market literally has changed completely in the last 2 months, really since the beginning of the year. I'll make one record. There's a reference here that no less than the CEO of Total last week said that by 2025, he's projecting as much as a 10 million barrel a day shortfall in oil demand or oil supply, literally because there's been not a dime spent around the world for a number of years. And last 2020 was an absolute disaster. So the consequence of if we go through about 100 million barrels per day and 10 million barrel, 10% shortfall, the price is going to follow. And that's probably the most encouraging kind of news. That's not rank speculation. That's the head of one of the biggest international companies saying this is on the horizon. And so I think we've had 10 really miserable years in oil and gas. And I think the next 10 are going to be 10 really good years. Yeah. On a macro scale.
Macro scale. Yeah. And you could argue, there's a lot of cheap money floating around the world now that's been printed. It does tend to lead to inflation eventually. And I believe, oil is probably one of the better performing commodities in an inflationary environment as well. With respect to a partner that you would bring in on this deal, is there who would make the ideal partner? Do you have somebody in mind or general characteristics?
In general, I think we would certainly welcome a partner with experience, with team, with knowledge, with access to the necessary equipment. I mean, there's many ways to structure a deal like this. You could bring in an equity partner that's just there for the dollars and cents, or you can bring in a partner that is an exploration significant player who has rigs sitting in the region, in the neighborhood. There's, as you've just discussed, there's not been a lot of exploratory work, so we know that there's access to local rigs in Thailand and Vietnam. We know we could bring in what we need from the neighborhood, and there's a lot of very interesting active players that have invested very significant dollars onshore and offshore in the region. But also, looking around the world, I've spent quite a bit of time over the last 2 years, meeting various groups in the Middle East, in India, in China, in Canada. There's no lack of interest, and the marketplace as a whole. I mean, sure, Cambodia needs everything they can get. So, but if we are successful in identifying a world-class basin, there's 2.5 billion people in the neighborhood between India, China, and everything in between. And these countries are all looking significantly for access to oil and gas. So it couldn't be better positioned for a regional play. So
okay,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it answers it. Thanks, Stephen. So it's on a similar note, I asked this, and we've already answered it partially because of our discussion about the macro situation, but obviously 2021 there is a huge focus on ESG investing. ESG tends to mean anti-oil and gas for the most part. Do you think there is still room or appetite for a junior exploration, junior oil exploration in this market that we exist in today?
Lorne, I'll take a first run, and then you can add in as well. The short answer is yes, absolutely. There's an appetite for it, and I think that while ESG is an extremely important discussion, you have to understand where we come from as a company in Cambodia, having spent the past 12 years in country, first as a private company and then IPOing in 2011. We have taken, now it's called ESG. Before that, it was social license to operate. Before that, it was corporate social responsibility. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's important. And we have held dear to that importance since the very beginning, since we arrived in Cambodia. So much so that we've been asked to present at the United Nations in Geneva numerous times to tell how we engage with the local community all the way through to the north, to the highest levels of government, to the Prime Minister's office, to adhere to international standards on environmental and social impact. And the government has put in place all of those necessary codes of ethics and operations to ensure that we adhere to international standards. So ESG is extraordinarily important. But I think what we need to remember is that you can operate in Cambodia. You can just as effectively as you would operate in a Canadian context or a North American or a European context, except you have a government that is there supportive of you to help you through that process and get these assets moving forward, so that the entire cycle is quite quick relative to other international systems. Whether identification of an asset, doing the exploratory work, ensuring that you're adhering to all codes and ethics and guidelines, working with local communities, you can build your understanding, you can do this work and bring all the way through to that production level in very, very short order, relatively speaking, in the context of Cambodia, that you can't necessarily achieve in Canada. We're adhering to the same rules. We have support from the local community all the way through the government, because they want to see development, and they deserve to see the ability, or have the ability, to benefit from these natural resources. Lorne, what do you think? Any additional comment?
Take it on two different levels. First is that there's virtually nobody exploring there's nobody left. I've worked with hundreds of geologists out of Calgary, and there's so few. None of the companies have got an exploratory budget. Exploration historically has come out of the cost side of the ledger, and as soon as things get tight, those are the guys that are gone. So exploration worldwide, I'd say, is at an all-time low right now. There's natural depletion of any oil reserve over time, and we do have. It's not a question of you can do this indefinitely. You do have to get back to exploring. And if it's not going to be the majors, I think it is going to be small independents that are leading the charge. I would bring up a point about Steve mentioned about Cambodia is as good as Canada. I think it's probably better. And I've running a small oil exploratory outfit in Canada here now, where it's coming impossible to get a license. We made a significant discovery a year ago, and we're trying just to get a license to drill a second well on the same land half a mile away. And it's taken us a year between, without getting into the details, the jurisdiction. And it's no different in the States. Biden today canceled the next federal offshore lease sale. That's a natural consequence of we use the term progressives that are trying to put every hurdle against the road in the way of any new oil and or gas development. And I get that. But it's really, really made it difficult for not just exploration, but development or any kind of work. Cambodia, I just can't believe how much it's changed in the 5 or 6 years that I've been going there. This is a very young country, and they want to make things happen. They want to be on a par with standard of living and lifestyle as the surrounding countries. And the way they do that is going to be, one of the reasons is going to be energy self-sufficiency. So I've found a very, very, and like I said, I've been in a number of meetings with the high-level officials over there through NRCam, very, very forward-thinking and very, very encouraging. So I couldn't be more excited to be working with these guys, and I think we just got to go through the process. The last couple of years have literally been a write-off for exploration worldwide, but all I see right now is that Cambodia is a really good place to be working, and if we could be the first mover on one block and carry those ideas onto others, we could own the show. Very encouraging.
Right. And I know this is probably a subjective statement, but the whole ESG process is sometimes a progression, and you could probably make the argument that, say, if Cambodia is getting a bunch of their energy from coal, if they were to develop a bunch of natural gas fields, that represents a much cleaner step towards an eventual say carbon-free energy decades from now. Is that fair?
I think it's a fair statement, and absolutely, we want to help and identify assets that will allow them to get into a cleaner energy production model, because that just goes without saying. Yeah. And self-sufficiency, that's a massively important component to the development of a country. Now, you're seeing more foreign direct investment coming into Cambodia than almost anywhere else in the region. They're growing at 7% GDP annually. And they've made it an environment where you can invest in country. You can understand where the flow of capital in and out of the country is unfettered. There's no, there are no hidden partners' expectations on your licenses. They've made an investable environment, and it's a really important component to this whole thing. As we are out in discussions with various potential partners, there is a bit of a hangover Cambodia has to deal with. And it's a misunderstanding and a lack of understanding of how much development really has taken place over the last 10 years. It's amazing how this country has changed. And it's positioned so well to just absolutely leapfrog all of the potential pitfalls, or the pitfalls that the neighbors fell into over their 40-year development on these industries. They're learning from that. They've paid attention. They saw where things didn't go quite well. They've made adjustments internally. They've had some missteps. There's no question about it. But right now, I think Cambodia has really developed a strong framework for which this industry can be built. And it's going to be on the backs of small companies like ourselves, independents like ourselves, doing that high risk, high reward activity. And then I don't think with a little bit of success, it's not going to take very long for majors to come and start really paying attention again.
Okay. And Stephen, one aspect of my question I asked earlier when it comes to ESG, I know you answered it well, and we covered that very well in the first interview, how important the social license is. And, the fact that the Prime Minister himself of Cambodia is giving you a shout out, I think is obviously clear evidence of that. But when it comes to the market being open to these kind of stories, are there other success stories in, say, the junior oil and exploration space that you can reference and say, this company has done well? You can still see that there's appetite in the market for this kind of business, for this side of the business.
I think the analog we would probably point to most common in our conversations is an African storyhead in Namibia called Recon. From a market perspective, they've done an exceptional job of building value for their shareholders, and it's not a dissimilar story. I don't pretend to know the company intimately. Never had any contact with them, so it's just what I can see online and through our review. But the reality is that if you look at there you go. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Look at the value creation over a 18-month window with that, roughly speaking. They must have, I think they're 50 cents up to $5 in market development and continuing. So I think that there is a real appetite for stories that are similar in nature to what we have here. I think it's growing. I think, as Lorne pointed out, there is going to be a need for new discoveries. And if you take all of the components to what we have, all the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, that we've identified so far in Cambodia, each step along the way, you try and de-risk the story as much as you can. And quite frankly, I don't think this aspect of our company is factored into our market cap whatsoever. So I think that this is, this actual interview is one of the very first that we've done as far as an in-depth look as to why we think there's great potential for Cambodia on the oil and gas side. Right. And it is something that we're going to be focusing on quite a bit more as we've now gone through the health crisis and able to start the conversations up again with the government. Of course, we need to secure the license and complete the production sharing contract. Only then would we be able to start moving forward on potential strategic partnerships and the development of our exploration planning at that point. So we still have work to do. But I certainly, to answer your question that you first started with, I think that there certainly are success stories that we've seen recently. And that Recon Africa is a perfect example.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy chart. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'd be very pleased if we saw something like that happen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Lorne, as a 40-year plus oil and gas guy, I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but if you are, do you think that the potential you see on Block 8 in Cambodia is as good as what they have there in Namibia?
Well, I'll start. I am only familiar with what I've read in the literature, but I have a banker's box of information on these guys, on their base and on their story. And I would go on record saying I think there's more similarities than differences. It's an onshore basin that really regional geology, regional structures have been extended or extrapolated from offshore, onshore, number one. Number two, it's the same age, Permian to Triassic in age, source rocks. Number three is that they're going from essentially, they've actually moved a drill rig into position now. They had no seismic. They're in the process of acquiring seismic right now. They had a big regional airborne geophysical program, a very strong technical team, but I think there's a lot to be said. It isn't going into an area where there was an established infrastructure. There isn't an area where there's an established history of exploration. And the basin is a little bit different in terms of geologic origin. One's a rift or fault related basin. Ours is a foreland basin. But in other aspects, I'd say it's a very similar story. Again, I'm hot as a pistol, anxious to get into having a look at the first seismic lines, because all indications are just offshore. There's a massive, thick sedimentary basin extending across Block 8, and no one's actually been down. No one's actually collected that data. So I'm really excited to be part of that. I wanted to catch one other thing you mentioned about the coal versus the natural gas, and this is important. In the United States, the transition from coal to natural gas, and you can look at in terms of total CO2, that transition of the last 10 years has done more to improve air quality in the United States than 50 years of EPA regulations, and that's fact. What's happened is natural gas is a much more cleaner burning material than coal. It doesn't have this nitric sulfur dioxides with it and the acid rain issues. It's a much better fuel all around, and you can use that. In Cambodia, the first time I went there, they had no central production of their own. All their electricity was brought in from either Thailand or Vietnam, and there'd be power outages if it came to a shortage, that literally the power would be shut down and they'd go hours or days without power. They've recently brought in big coal burning plants, and the grid is basically centered right at Kampot, where our Block 8 is set up. But again, it's coal burning, and I would look at this saying natural gas, you could still say is a CO2 generator, but it's the lesser of two evils. And certainly the American administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, have gone on side, because it's been a huge improvement in air quality. It's still not net zero, but it's far better than coal. And the record speaks for itself in the States. If you look at total CO2 and air quality, all the EPA guidelines, it's been a much improvement. So in a country that needs it, a natural gas would probably be the best story for fueling. You go to the garment factories that employ 1 million people outside of Phnom Penh, and that is a number, 1 million people, and they're all essentially fired by independent power generation plants because that regional energy infrastructure isn't there. We would love to be able to be fueling those with natural gas or locally generated propane or oil and gas or oil.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, it is a progression, right? And I mean, well, you cited some data there that kind of supports that progression. When you look at it, I know this is subjective. Some people are adamant, natural gas can't be part of it, but the more practical side of it is it does produce significant benefits to CO2 emissions and clean air. So, well,
also,
gentlemen,
on the environmental side, just one other point is the area we're working in, for the most part, is not pristine wilderness. It's area that's it's agriculture, it's rice paddies, it's fully accessible. There are some park areas which we've committed to stay out of, and we're obviously respecting that. But the other thing we've got in new technologies is directional drilling. If there are issues with access in terms of environmental concerns or even cultural, if there's towns, cities, development, the directional technology that's out there is spectacular right now in terms of how far reach you can drill. You can drill from a central pad and you can radiate wells out, build a little retaining wall, and you don't even know that production is there. So the idea of the technology has gone so far. On the environmental side, to me, this isn't an issue or concern whatsoever. I think the social responsibility side, I think Angkor and Enercam have a 10-year plus history of working well with the locals, with not only the central government, but all the local jurisdictions. And I think there's no reason to believe we wouldn't do the same.
Okay. Yeah. Well, gentlemen, very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. This has been great. Lorne, great to meet you and to have you on the show. And Stephen, really great to have you back as well. I think this represents a really interesting part of your business. And Stephen, I would agree, based on your market cap, it's probably unlikely that you're getting much value, if at all, here. Or certainly you can make the argument one side, whether the hard rock side or the oil side, is getting zero. One of the two. I don't know which it is, but anyway, for those of you watching and tuning in, you can make that judgment for yourself. And the shares are trading if you like what you hear. So if anyone wants to reach out to learn more on the oil and gas side, who would they contact? Stephen, was it be you, or?
Always best just to reach out to me. Okay. My email address and phone number will be made available, and certainly don't hesitate to contact. And thank you, John, very much for giving us the time today to tell you a little bit more about what our plans are for the oil and gas side of the story.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, you guys stay warm. Stephen, I hope the snow you're getting there doesn't break your back on the shoveling side of things.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, take care, guys.
Have a great day. Thanks so much, John.
Cheers.